The Civil War is the most defining, the most important event in American history. Everything before it, led up to it, everything since, even though it seems so far away, is in some ways a consequence of it. How could we not be drawn to try to figure out what actually happened? Not just the causes and effects that we get taught in school, not just, you know, the sort of rudimentary, superficial look, but what actually happened. It matters very much what transpired at Shiloh and Antietam and Gettysburg and Spotsylvania, because hundreds of thousands of Americans lost their lives in these battles over essentially American issues on both sides of the argument. And it continues to reverberate to this day. I think the Civil War was after me for a long time. I think it really demanded to be done. All the films that I had worked on before the Civil War had it as the determining factor in some strange way. The Brooklyn Bridge wouldn't have been built without this new metal called steel, which the war helped to promote. The man who built the Brooklyn Bridge, Washington Roebling, got his practical training as a bridge builder during the Civil War. The Shakers, the subject of our second film, declined precipitously after the Civil War, not just because of the social and economic changes that took place in America, but the sort of spiritual, psychic changes in a country that had just murdered 620,000 of their own people. My next film was on the Statue of Liberty. That was originally intended as a gift from the French to Mrs. Lincoln to commemorate the Union's survival despite her husband's ultimate sacrifice. We made a film on Huey Long. Huey Long came from a dirt-poor North Louisiana parish that thought the Confederacy was a rich man's cause and refused to secede, and became a kind of hotbed of populism and radicalism that eventually spawned this swamp thing called Huey Long. The next film was on the history of the Congress, and the greatest crisis in the history of the Congress was when there were two Congresses because of the Civil War, and so it begged me to treat it. And I remember I was thinking about it, not talking to anybody about it, but I read a novel of the Battle of Gettysburg called The Killer Angels, and I finished it on Christmas Day, 1984. I was visiting my father in Western Michigan. I remember he walked into the living room, and I had just closed the book, and I said, I know what I'm going to do next. And he said, what? And I said, the Civil War. And he said, oh, what part? And I said, all of it. And I remember he just sort of shook his head like my idiot son and walked out of the room. As in every project, it's a huge detective piece, and that detective piece begins usually with the visual archival record. And in the case of the Civil War, we went to 163 different archives, but thank goodness most of it is in stuff that you and I and everyone within the sound of my voice owns. That is to say, the Library of Congress and the National Archives particularly, that have the amazing collections of photographs of Matthew Brady and other of the celebrated photographers of the period that we drew on. We discovered a photograph of Robert E. Lee tucked under the leaf of a cardboard box of extra shots at the Museum of the Confederacy. A view of Lee I'd never seen before, with a kind of quaint smile, almost Mona Lisa-like smile that I hadn't seen in any of the books. I remember taking in my 2 scoop umbrella lamps and bringing them into a corner of the Library of Congress and National Archives and putting up a easel with a metal board and affixing magnets to them, and spending literally weeks, day in and day out, re-photographing, filming these still photographs. Not just at arm's length, but going inside them, and sometimes taking 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 images from one static photograph, with this idea that once we complemented it with a complex sound effects and music and first-person voice as well as third-person narration, you could make that past, you could try to will that past alive.
When Lee's Confederates reached the edge of the wilderness, Union troops moved out to engage them. The fighting had hardly begun when Fighting Joe Hooker inexplicably ordered his forces back to defensive positions around the Chancellor House. To tell the truth, he later tried to explain, I just lost confidence in Joe Hooker.
The Civil War defined us as what we are, and it opened us to being what we became, good and bad things.
We had just finished a film on Huey Long. It was an hour-and-a-half film. It had, I think, something like 36 different interview subjects. So I suddenly thought, oh, here's a long-form documentary. The first time I'd gone into multiple parts. This is going to have hundreds of people. And we were sort of collecting the long, endless list of who it should be. And I was eating dinner one night in Walpole, New Hampshire, where I live. The telephone rang, and it was Robert Penn Warren, the first poet laureate of the United States, a great poet, but also wonderful novelist. And he had spoken this wonderful Kentucky accent, very elliptical. He says, thinking about the Civil War, thinking about how if you're gonna do it right, you have to talk to Shelby Foote right away. Well, sitting on our shelf was the massive 3-volume, 3,000-page epic work by Shelby Foote. And I just sort of thought, this is, our guide. One does not ignore the poet laureate of the United States. So the first rolls that we exposed of 60mm film was an interview we did with Shelby Foote.
They knew what they were going to do, but they had to wait. And while they were waiting, formed and ready to move out, they were in defilade among brush and things. And a rabbit jumped out of the bushes and took off rearward. And one of the soldiers looked after him and hollered, run, old Hal. If I was old Hal, I'd run too. Sure, it wasn't all valor. Yeah.
We worked with Shelby the first time, and then we went back about a year later when we felt we'd gotten smarter, that we could ask more intelligent questions, we thought. You know, we'd come with sort of high school term paper-like questions, and pretty soon I was just saying Grant, Nathan Bedford Forrest, whatever it would be, and he would answer these fantastically beautiful sound bites, storytelling that evoked the age and helped to bring it alive. But one thing he wanted us to do was see Shiloh, which was a battlefield that is not as visited as the more prominent eastern ones like Antietam and Gettysburg. And we wanted to go there more or less when the battle happened in early April. It happened in 1862, and it was as big as Waterloo, and there were 20 Waterloos to come. And then another time we took him down to Vicksburg so he could show us the very complicated situation of the siege and assault of Vicksburg that Grant waged. And in the course of that, we were in a van, all of us in a rented van, and he kept saying things from the back seat that I just finally said, damn it, Shelby. And I stopped the car, we opened the door, and we literally filmed him on the side of the battlefield road because it seemed like every time we spoke to him, there was something new that he was going to give us, something that added a dimension that we hadn't seen.
Grant himself gave them confidence. They believed Grant knew what he was doing. And one great encouragement for their believing that was quite often on the march, whether at night or in the daytime, they'd be moving along a road or over a bridge, and right beside the road would be Grant on his horse, a dust-covered man on a dust-covered horse saying, move on, close up. So they felt very much that he personally was in charge of their movement, and it gave them an added confidence.
We were terrified while we were working. First of all the films we'd made had been an hour or an hour and a half. They were filled with still photographs. And here we were, expanding it to 11 and a half hours. All during it, you knew that you were working on something good, but it was so hard and so terrifying. I asked Shelby Foote once about Grant. He said, Grant had what they call 4 o'clock in the morning courage. That meant you could wake him up at 4 o'clock in the morning and tell him that the enemy had turned his left flank and he'd be as cool as a cucumber. And I remember thinking how many times I woke up at 4 in the morning going, and wishing that I had 4 o'clock in the morning courage, and learning, I guess, over the course of the 5.5 years that it took to make this thing from conception to broadcast, that I had to learn that. We would try to do the battles on the day that they actually took place. So you'd be at Gettysburg on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd and hope that the atmospherics were the same. But we're also filming more often than not in the early morning and the late afternoon or evening, the magic hours. What occurs in those moments, why we call it magic hour, is because the light lengthens, the shadows lengthen. Something is changed. Emily Dickinson called sunrises and sunsets the far theatricals of day. And so when you're participating in trying to capture the far theatricals of day, stuff happens and you begin to feel the presence of what's going on. You're usually alone. You're not crowded, say at Gettysburg with other tourists there. You're alone, and all of a sudden you're thinking, oh my God, I'm where Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain decided to fix the bayonets because he was running out of ammunition and execute this obscure textbook maneuver in which he divided his already thin troops and like a gate on a post swung down and completely surprised Oates's Alabamians who were coming up Little Round Top and perhaps saved the Union position that afternoon, and quite possibly the Union itself. You begin to feel that, and it gets pretty exciting. The technology has changed a lot, but for us, we kind of put on the brake. We still shoot on film for the most part. But we no longer go to the archives and put up our easel with our magnets and film that. We order them digitally sometimes, and we perform all our moves digitally, which I regret. We still get up at 3 in the morning and get those morning shots and stay up really late to get those evening shots. We still interview in the same way. The script process and the process of editing is more or less the same. We finally, after Jazz in 2001, stopped editing on film, snipping and taping and having thousands of miles of missing footage at all times, in favor of digital editing, which is far and away wonderful. But there's that lack of the sort of sense of holding the film and saying, this is reel one, you know, and feeling like it is. I think it's not that we've resisted change, we just know the way in which change too often is the tail that wags the dog, that we get into, you know, sophisticated movements and title designs and forget to pay attention to the whole film. So we try to really focus on just being good filmmakers, which is essentially telling good stories.
I'm a tired man, Lincoln said afterwards. Sometimes I think I'm the tiredest man on earth. In the crowd, just a few yards from Lincoln, was the young actor John Wilkes Booth, a pistol in his pocket. His vantage point on the balcony, Booth said afterwards, had offered an excellent chance to kill the president, if I had wished.
The Civil War is the traumatic event in the childhood of our nation. So I think if you have even a halfway emotional treatment of this war in which so many people have either opinions about or have lost a relationship to, opinions that are usually wrong or superficial, or have just felt that because of the passage of time it doesn't matter, and you remind them the way in which it does matter. It doesn't really have to do with the skill of the filmmaker as much as it has to do with the centrality of the subject in American life. We touched a nerve, and people went, oh.
We have shared the incommunicable experience of war. We have felt, we still feel, the passion of life to its top. In our youths, our hearts were touched with fire. Oliver Wendell Holmes.